It's great to welcome to the program today Martin Gurri, who is a former CIA analyst and author of The Revolt of the Public, first published in 2014 and updated in 2018. Great to have you on, Martin. I appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
So when you look back at some of the revolts of the last decade, Occupy Wall Street, the Hong Kong protests, Arab Spring, we're seeing unrest in Paris right now. Do you see any sort of common thread between them?
Well, what we have is essentially a eruption from below that's made possible by the fact that I think our systems of government, which are whether they're democratic or dictatorial, based on the industrial model. This is when our government took its form, can't withstand the amount of information that the digital world has thrown at it. So they have very much in common. They seem to be, the model is almost like an internet chat room where there's no leaders, there are no spokespersons, there are no programs, certainly no ideologies, but they're very anti-ideology. So as you can tell, I am not a young person. When I was young, if you could have a radical movement, you needed essentially a mini hierarchy that you wanted to overthrow the government with. Today, that is not at all what you see in any of those revolts.
That's interesting. And so, in a sense, it's the technology of the last 10 years that have enabled, I guess we would call it a flatter infrastructure rather than a hierarchical one to take hold.
Yeah, I think it's a collision between information enabled by technology and systems and it's not just government. I think you could say the same about every major institution that modern society is sustained by. Systems that require control over the information in their own domains. And because of this enormous tsunami of information generated by the digital universe, that semi-monopoly of information has been lost. And the second that happened, these institutions, including government, including politics, political parties, say, have lapsed into what I've called a crisis of authority.
It seems that this is a double-edged sword, though, in the sense that on the one hand, the internet has greatly democratized reporting, information availability, diversity of sources, so on and so forth. And at the same time, this has been a catalyst for the crisis of fake news and disinformation, the inability to distinguish fact, fiction, opinion, and reporting, so on and so forth. What's your sense of the balance of those two forces?
Well, I mean, I think there is no balance. I think we are in a totally fractured environment. When you have a crisis of authority, you are bound to get a crisis of uncertainty. Okay, so people live in what I call the public. I don't mean by that the people. I don't mean by that the masses. The public is essentially the old mass audience, which in my day, when I was younger, it was like an enormous mirror that you saw yourself reflected in. Well, that mirror has shattered, has fallen, it has shattered, and the public lives in the broken pieces. And each piece seems to have its own way of collecting and analyzing information that can be very different from all the others. The pieces are mutually hostile and barely sometimes connect about what is a fact and what isn't.
One of the things that I find really interesting that you write about is that it is much easier for large groups of the public to unify around something that they are against, something that they reject, than it is around sort of positive things that they want to do. And this, when you look at, for example, local news and you see how sensationalism and stories of crime and negativity do far better than other types of stories, there seems to be something inherent there to the way that people are motivated to say to their neighbor, hey, did you see this bad thing that's going on? That is much more, there's something about that spurs action much more than, hey, let's get together and do this positive thing. Do you agree with that assessment? And what are the implications of that when it comes to activism?
Well, when you look at that fractured environment I just described, each one of those fragments has its own, you could be the Tea Party, you could be a feminist, you could be Bernie bro. There's very, very different ways of parsing information and data. Um, and if you want to mobilize and unify this very fractured environment, the only way to do so is by being against. And there is this tremendous swelling of anger against the established order. So what you have in many of these revolts, and you can start with Tahrir Square in Egypt and all the way to Hong Kong, you have people from every kind of political opinion, but they are unified against. They want to overthrow the system as they exist. The danger, as you point out, is if you're against and you are, as these people tend to be, not interested in alternatives, then you can run into what I call nihilism, which is basically the belief that destruction of the system for its own sake is a form of progress. And I mean, I leave you to consider that. I don't think it is.
Well, that seems to be one of the big divisions that exists on the left right now, which is the work with the system to improve it mentality compared to the burn it all down to eventually rebuild something better ideology. I don't have any moral imperative one way or the other. I think if you look at history, the incrementalism seems to have achieved more as I understand it, but I'm not ideologically or emotionally attached to one movement or the other. But that seems to be a very prominent discussion happening right now on the left.
Well, you burn it all down, then what? The difference between today and say 1917, you were a Bolshevik, or even 1959, you were a Castroist, is you have an organization, a program, and a set of ideologies, and you want power to put those in place. You tear it all down today, what do you get? You basically have people who are activists in condemning the government and then turning around and asking the same government that they are condemning, well, we need you to do this and that and the other, versus I want to take over. The era of revolution, in my humble opinion as an analyst, pretty much died in 1991. So you're not going to do the Bolsheviks or Havana, Cuba in 59 over again. So what the public can't yet do, that maybe it should be working towards, is articulate positive demands. What is it that it can actually share together when it rises up, like it does in Hong Kong, like it does in Chile, for example?
Well, the one that now seems to be potentially on the cusp is the movement in the United States for some kind of single payer healthcare system or Medicare for all, which is, as it sees itself anyway, it sees itself as a positive movement. It wants to do something good. It is a movement that believes it can improve things for people if the system is changed. But at the same time, it's been born in opposition to the status quo. So would you consider that movement a movement for something, or is it still a movement against?
I mean, I find it kind of a circular thing. You're saying that the people in charge are corrupt, as usually the charge has made. They are incompetent. They are distant and self-serving. Okay, and yet you're saying, well, but I have this massive government program that I want to hand to them. That just doesn't work. I mean, my feeling is, you're talking policy, and that part of what depresses me a lot about the current political environment is that's the standard way of talking. You talk policy. I'm for Medicare. I'm against Medicare. I want to up it. I want to lower it. That's fine. But what you have today is a tremendous rebellion against the distance between the top of the system and the bottom. And any policy you put in there, the massive amount of distrust is going to generate, it's going to spark another revolt. You do what you do. We're just suggesting you're going to get another Tea Party, probably.
Yeah, but let's break that down a little bit, because I think you're right that there's a rejection of the status quo. There's a rejection of what have become the structures of power and the hierarchical difference and inequality. But I think
the people who are actually doing it.
I think that the movement for something like Medicare for all, they don't see the government necessarily as the problem. I think they see the government as having been co-opted by for-profit corporations, and that's what they want to remove. It's not the government that they want to remove. So I don't know that I see the inconsistency that you're pointing out there.
Well, I mean, my research with, I mean, now dozens of these revolts, it's pretty clear that the government, I mean, and the data is there here in the US too, government levels of distrust are just crashing through the floor. I mean, I won't say they're at rock bottom. They could still fall a little bit. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of the electorate trust their elected government. Think about that. So what you are saying, though, is you're conceiving of some gigantic program that are then going to be handing off to this body that you absolutely distrust. I think before we get to the program, we need to reform the system so that the distance is lowered and trust. And so kind of you can reconcile the public to our forms of democracy.
What would be steps that could be taken to remove that distance and to increase trust in the institutions of power? I mean, it seems to me that separating the corporate sort of hierarchy and influence on government would be a great first step.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem is in this fractured environment, nobody's going to trust you that it's really happening. The second you stop seeing it out in front, you're going to start believing that it's happening behind closed doors. So what you need is a system that I would say a good beginning would be push as much decision making down to as local a level as possible. So there are as few levels between you and the power that is making decisions as you can get it to be. All right. I mean, how many hundreds of levels of bureaucracy are there between you and the president of the United States? He might as well live in Mount Olympus with the gods, which is the Emmanuel Macron ambition, right? So that has to change. And the one way to start changing that is to bring down decision-making as local as possible, where people are as visible as possible and react as immediately as possible to pressure from below, from the voters.
The book is fascinating. It's called The Revolt of the Public, first published in 2014 and updated in 2018. We've been speaking with the book's author, former CIA analyst Martin Gurri. Martin, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time today.
Yeah, I love being here.